Hi, in this video we'll create a component to display a list of users that we'll get from a real API. We'll also make it customizable so that we can specify how many users we want to display in the list. To start things off, I created this simple UI for displaying a single user item. So we have just a container frame with another frame for showing user avatar, and then two labels for showing username and email. Now we want to turn this UI into an actual design component. And once we've done that, we want to go and make sure that all of our properties are overridable, meaning that we can change them in all the instances of this master component. So now we can start working on our contact list component. So I'm going to switch to the code tab and create a new code component that will be called contact list. I'm going to remove all the default code that FramerX created for us. To get a list of users, we're going to use randomuser.me public API that generates random user information, which includes avatar, name, email address, as well as some other personal information. If we go to documentation tab, we can find the response format for this API, as well as the actual URL that we need to call to request multiple users. So I'm going to grab this URL and bring it over to our code editor. Whenever we need to call an API from our component, we're going to use an effect hook from React library. And effect hook, it's a function that takes two arguments. The first argument should be a function which will contain an actual API call, and the second one will just pass an empty array for now. We'll talk more about its significance later. To make an API call, we're going to call a fetch function that takes the URL from which we want to fetch the data. And we probably don't want to get 5,000 records, so let's choose 5 for now. So once we get the data, then we want to work with the response object. Our response is going to be a JSON, so we want to parse it as JSON. And once we get to this JSON data, we want to store it in the component state. To do that, we're going to use another hook from React library called useState. useState takes one argument with the initial state, and since we'll be working with an array of users, we can specify just an empty array. Now, this function returns an array with two values, where the first value is the state itself, so we're going to call it users, and the second value is the function that we can call to update the state, so we'll call this function setUsers. Now we just need to make sure that we save the data that we get from an API in our local state. And if we go back to the documentation for a moment, we can see that the JSON that we receive will be an object with the property results, and that is the actual array of users that we want to store. So from inside of our function, we want to call setUsers and pass it JSON.results. Great, we have our data, so now let's talk about how we're going to display it. First of all, we want to import our contact item component. And to do that, we can import from a special file called canvas, which contains auto-generated code for all the design components that we have on our canvas. So let's import contact item. We want to organize our contact items in a stack, and we can use the same stack component that we would use in a canvas, but from our code. And to do that, we're going to import stack component from Framer package. Now we can create a new stack component from code. And we want to specify gap property, which will be 0, so we don't want to have any space in between our contact list items. And I'll set the alignment for our stack to start. Now we need to specify the items for our stack. And to do that, we're going to iterate over all of our users. And for every user record, we're going to create a new contact item component. Contact item component expects 3 properties to be passed in: avatar, name, and email. We can use random.me API documentation once again to see how we can get access to those fields. So we can see that email is available as a top-level property on our user subject. Then to get the name, we need to access name property and then combine first and last properties. And for avatar, we're going to access picture property that will contain an object with different thumbnails. So we're going to use the medium one. So let's switch back to the editor and start filling those in. So for avatar, we want to call user.picture.medium. For email, it's just user.email. And name, we want to combine it from the first and last name. So I'm going to use a template literal with 2 properties. The first one, user.name.first and user.name.last. We need to pass one more React specific property called key, which is required to uniquely identify an item whenever we work with the arrays. So for the key, I'm going to use user.name.last. So we'll assume that the last name is unique among all of our records. To see how our component looks, I'm going to switch to Components tab and drag it onto the canvas. And as you can see, it looks pretty nice, but right now there is no way to change how many records it displays. So next, let's work on that. In React, to pass properties to our components, we use something called props. So our function over here can take an object that will contain some configuration properties. So first, let's define the type for the properties. We want to customize the number of records that we display. So we're just going to define a property called count, which will be a number. And now inside of our contact list function arguments, we can specify that the arguments will be of type props, and we can destructure count property. Now we want to use this property inside of our URL over here. So first of all, I'm going to replace double quotes with backticks to turn this string into a template literal. And then I'm going to replace the hard-coded value with our count. And I can specify the default value of 5 over here. Now we need to give FramerX more information about this property so that it can build a UI for it. So to do that, we're going to import add property controls function from Framer package, as well as control type enum. Now on the bottom, we can call add property controls, specify our contact list component, and then we need to pass an object with all the properties that we want to have customizable. So we want to have our count property, and then we need to specify its type, which will be of type number. We want to specify its title, as it will be displayed in FramerX UI. So we're going to just pass count, and we can also specify the default value for it, which will be 5. Now we can switch back to the canvas view, and as you can see, our contact list component now has count property. So let's change it from 5 to 3. and it didn't work. Now, to understand why it didn't work, we need to go back to our code and talk about useEffectHook and how it works. The second argument to useEffectHook controls how often the hook body will be executed. And when we pass it as an empty array, we're effectively telling React that this code should be executed only once when component is created, but no matter how many times we change count property or any of the properties of this component later, this code will never be executed again. And that's why when we change count from 5 to 3, we didn't see any change, because even though the property was changed, the code that is responsible for calling an API with this number never get executed. To fix this problem, we just need to pass our count property in the array that we pass for the second argument, which means that useEffectHook will be executed initially when the component gets mounted, as well as every time our count property changes. So the second argument specifies an array of dependencies for this effect, so that effect will be executed every time each of the dependencies changes. Now we can switch to Canvas view and let's change the number of records for contact list from 5 to 3, and it seems to be working. And that is the end of this tutorial. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe to the channel to get more Frameworks tutorials, and I'll see you in the next one.